All right, I'm going to get us started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jamie Swain, and I'm the president of VPM, which is your local PBS station. Thank you for virtually joining us today. I hope you were able to watch the first episode of our three-part series, Dismantling Democracy, which VPM produced in partnership with the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Now, this series looks at democracy in the United States and around the world. The first episode looks at democracy here in America. And for those that watched, I hope you found it provocative, and it might have even been a little scary at times. We are incredibly proud of this docuseries, which will air nationally in PBS stations across the country in October. But here locally, you've already seen the first episode, or at least I hope you have. Episode 2 will air on September 15th at 8 p.m., and episode 3 will air September 22nd at 8. So September 15th and September 22nd, both at 8. So please mark your calendars. And if you miss any of that, we will be streaming the series as well on our website, vpm.org, and also on Amazon. And those will all be available in October. So before we begin this wonderful discussion with our esteemed panelists, I want to thank our incredible producers at Make Films, Alan Clements and Derek Deemer, who did an amazing job. Our narrator, Tara Setmeyer. Happy birthday, Tara. Welcome, who's joined us on her birthday. So thank you for that. And certainly our partners at the UVA Center for Politics, particularly Glenn Crossman. Thank you so much for your collaboration and partnership through this entire process. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank the VPM team, our Chief Content Officer, Steve Humble, and Associate Producer, Ellie Hannibal, who really shepherded this project throughout the entire thing. And of course, the incomparable Larry Sabato, who I don't think needs an introduction. You all know him as Director of UVA Center for Politics. And Larry's vision was really what brought us this film and creating this series. Now, I was a politics major at UVA. You may see some of the UVA stuff behind me. And as one of Larry's students, he really drills into you the fundamentals about democracy and also all of our individual responsibility to a system that we often take for granted. I remember when we talked about this, when Larry, Glenn, and I talked about this series a year and a half ago, and it was one of those things I think we wanted to rush to the fore at the moment because it felt so important. But I think actually waiting a year and a half and really spending the time, I don't think there's any more important discussion right now in this polarized climate that we're in and on the heels of an election as it comes to us talking about democracy and the importance of democracy and the fragility of democracy here in the United States. So with that, let me turn it over to Larry Sabato, who will lead us and lead the discussion today. Larry.
Jamie, that's a great kickoff here. We appreciate it. We're particularly happy that you are a Wahoo, you are a UVA graduate. We're proud of you and look forward to many more projects in the future. And this one really did come together at the right moment. This is a presidential election season, and Americans are faced with a vital choice, probably the most vital in my lifetime. We always say that an election is the most important ever. This one may actually be. So it's great to work with you and with Virginia Public Media. And your continued partnership with the Center for Politics means a great deal to us. And thank you, and thank all of your wonderful staff there. Welcome, everybody, to the first half of today's Global Democracy Forum. For those of you in the Central Virginia area, as Jamie just suggested, I hope you were able to tune in to the first episode of this newest collaboration, Dismantling Democracy. If you missed it last night, you can see it this Sunday at 2 p.m. on Virginia Public Media. Episode 2 will air at 8 p.m. on September 15th, and episode 3 will air at 8 p.m. on September 22nd. I know you're going to remember all that. It's on our website, centerforpolitics.org. Series on the state of democracy here in the United States, but also around the world. This really is global. I think it reads better than a novel, and it's more like a Stephen King novel, meaning it's scary, but it's important that we all understand what the stakes are, and that's what this is all about. Now, it's also beginning to air on PBS stations around the country. In fact, I think it started last week. And this I found interesting. It will soon be available on Amazon Prime. So check your local listings. The Center for Politics has been making documentaries with our partners at VPM for 20 years. Thank you, Jamie and Steve, for an extremely fruitful partnership. Last year, we all together won our 4th Emmy for Charlottesville, which told the story of that terrible moment back in August 11th and 12th of 2017. I do want to thank Make Films, that's the name of the group, Make Films, for producing Dismantling Democracy. They've raised the bar for our photography and overall production. And I also want to thank our media sponsor for today's event, a terrific magazine called Virginia Business. If you don't subscribe or read it, you should, Virginia Business. For those of you who may miss some of the programs, you can watch all of the past programs on our YouTube channel. Just search YouTube for UVA CFP, all capitals, no dots, UVA Center for Politics, UVA CFP. You can also listen to our programming as a podcast. Go to our website, centerforpolitics.org, and click on podcasts. We're now on all the major podcast platforms, so search for us on your favorite app and continue to watch our website for updates. Before I introduce the panel, this is the longest introduction in history. I think this is the end of it. Let's show a quick trailer explaining all 3 episodes. Go.
We're beginning to look like a little bit of the America of the Hunger Games.
If we're not all in this together, our democracy may be at risk. Join us for this 3-part series. Part 1 examines domestic threats to our democratic system. Part 2 looks at the declining state of democracies around the world. Part 3 attempts to find solutions to preserve democracy for the next generation.
If this system continues without reform, I think there is a very real possibility of violence and potentially a split in the United States.
And if we lose faith in that system, then we have to be content with whatever comes along. And literally anything could come along.
When I was a little kid.
I thought it was a little bit longer, but we just roll with the punches here. So we'll keep going. And I want to turn this over briefly here to Tara Setmeyer. Tara narrated the series Dismantling Democracy. She's also a resident scholar at the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia this year. Tara, and listen to this list, she's a CNN political commentator. She's an ABC News political contributor. She's the former Republican communications director on Capitol Hill. She's a 2020 Harvard Institute of Politics resident fellow. And she currently hosts her own podcast, Honestly Speaking with Tara. And today is her birthday. She's somewhere in the 20s. She's not looking forward to 30, but that's years off. Tara, take it over.
Oh, God bless you, Larry, for saying I'm in my 20s. I wish, but thank you so much for having me. It would have been remiss of me not to be a part of this today, despite it being my birthday. That doesn't matter. This was such an amazing project to work on, and it was such a pleasure to be a part of what you're doing there at UVA. I'm thrilled to be a resident scholar for you guys coming up for this academic year. But working on the Dismantling Democracy documentary was an absolute thrill, and it really could not have been better timed. With COVID kind of upsetting the apple cart with everything, and it turned from hosting on camera to a full narration. And I think that actually was for the better, given the gravity of what we're talking about, and the way it turned out was really just fantastic. Everyone who participated in it brought something to the table that was intense and relevant. And I really think that the climate that we're in politically right now, not only in the United States, but around the world, questioning what's happening with our democracies is more relevant now than ever. So I really, really cannot thank you guys enough for giving me the opportunity to be a part of such a wonderful project. And I hope that people take away from it as much as I did. It's so important for an informed citizenry, right? Thomas Jefferson talks about that the importance of our newspapers and the freedom of the press and the importance of having an informed citizenry, because without one, our tyranny is around the corner, basically. And I think when you have documentaries like this, and everyone that was involved in it, we all play a different role with our platforms and what we know and our knowledge bases and our experiences. We all play a role in helping to inform the citizenry, because without that, our democracy cannot succeed. And, Thomas Jefferson also wasn't afraid to be bold, and he wasn't afraid to pursue knowledge wherever that may have led him. And I think that's what we all need to learn from this. We need to make sure that we are continuing to be bold and continue to pursue knowledge wherever that truth and reason may lead us, because without that, I fear where the future of our republic may go. So thank you for letting me drop in and say hello and sing the praises of this wonderful documentary. I hope everyone enjoys it and watches it. And I think it's something that that people will remember for quite some time, because we are literally living the dismantling of our democracy.
Tara, that's fantastic. You summarized the series well. Now, it's your birthday. You're on the Jersey Shore.
I am.
Go out there and have a good time. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really quick. It was my anniversary last weekend, and we spent it down there in Virginia wine country, and it was absolutely wonderful. So for people who live in the area or near there, go and enjoy it. It's wonderful there. And I am from New Jersey. I'm a proud Jersey girl. So my happy place is down the shore. So at least I get a chance to do that and be here with you guys as well virtually. So thank you all so much.
Terrific, Tara. We look forward to seeing you soon as a resident scholar at the Center for Politics.
Me too.
Now, let me introduce our panel for the next hour, or less than an hour now. All three panelists are featured in the series, our series, Dismantling Democracy, and they did a wonderful job. You're really going to enjoy their commentary in the three-part series. Let me start with Stephen Levitsky. He's a professor of government at Harvard University. His research interests include political parties, authoritarianism, and democratization. Also weak and informal institutions with a focus on Latin America. He's the author of many books and other respected publications, particularly his co-authorship of How Democracies Die, which has rightly received a great deal of attention given what's happening around the world. That's featured also in the documentary. He's currently engaged in research on the durability of revolutionary regimes, the relationship between populism and competitive authoritarianism, the problems of party building in contemporary Latin America, and party collapse and the consequences for democracy in Peru. Next, Christopher Sabatini is a senior fellow for Latin America at Chatham House. He was formerly a lecturer at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Chris is also on the advisory boards of Harvard's LASPAO, the Advisory Committee for Human Rights Watch's America's Division, and of the Inter-American Foundation. He is also an HFX Fellow at the Halifax International Security Forum. Chris, more importantly, is a former teaching assistant of mine, and he did a terrific job. I think it was 20 years ago when he was young, and he always got great evaluations. And Chris, it's wonderful to have you too. Nicole Bivens-Sadaka serves as the Deputy Director of Georgetown University's Master of Science in Foreign Service. She also serves as the co-chair for the Global Politics and Security Concentration and is a professor in the practice of international affairs. I don't know how you all made time for this documentary series. You're all so busy. Ms. Bivens-Shidaka has held numerous positions in the public and non-governmental sectors in the United States and Ecuador. She served for 10 years in the United States Department of State, working on democracy promotion, human rights, human trafficking, religious freedom, refugees, and counterterrorism. Well, this is a great panel. And let me start by asking each one of you, in the order I introduced you, about your assessment of democracy in the world generally, and then specifically the state of democracy in the United States. It's a very simple question.
In 30 seconds or
go.
less.
Yes.
I think the state of democracy in the world is not quite as bad as people often say. We are coming from a point that will probably never repeat, going back to the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the United States and Europe were the world's dominant political, economic, ideological power, and which liberal democracy became, for about 15 years, the only game in town. That was the most favorable period for democracy, for global democracy imaginable. And that's where we saw this great burst of democratization across the world. The world has changed a lot in the last 15, 20 years in ways that are pretty unfavorable for democracy. The West has lost power relative to China and Russia. The liberal democratic model, certainly as practiced in the United States, has lost its luster. Almost nobody outside of the Bolsonaro family in Brazil looks to the United States as a model anymore. So the global environment is much less favorable for democracy than it was 20 years ago. All of that said, I think statements about a global democratic recession and an authoritarian resurgence are somewhat overstated, because the number of democracies in the world has been basically a flat line over the last 15 years. There are a number of serious challenges. There are cases and trends that are really troublesome, but we have yet to see an outright collapse of democracy, or a collapse in the number of democracies across the world. And one reason for that is we have yet to see, and I hope we don't see, the emergence of a really viable alternative to liberal democracy. Most citizens in most parts of the world continue to have kind of a Churchillian view of democracy. They don't like their own democracy. They got all kinds of problems with the parties, the politicians, the institutions of their country, but they don't much like the alternatives either. People, and certainly in the region that I study, Latin America, still want the ability to elect their governments, and particularly to remove bad governments they don't like. There's nobody in Latin America on the streets calling for a China model or a Russia model. Electoral democracy still continues to be the dominant form system that people want. So there are storm clouds on the horizons. Particularly the complete absence of democracy promotion that we're now seeing in the United States is really troublesome. But we've yet to see the kind of catastrophic collapse of democracy that some people are worried about. The United States, I'm a little more pessimistic. I think that Daniel Ziblatt and I, if anything, were too optimistic when we wrote our book in 2017, 18. Things have been worse than we expected, mainly because we expected that the Republican Party would be able to put a brake on President Trump. Trump has behaved pretty much as many of us expected, but I expected that he would be constrained by the Republican Party, and that has not happened much. So I worry a lot about this election. I agree with you, Larry. This 2020 election really is likely to be the most important in our lifetimes, and it could be really determinative of where this democracy goes in the medium term.
Steve, that's sobering, but it's interesting to hear you compare where democracy is in the United States with where it is in most of the world, and that's a little more encouraging. So we thank you for that. Let's go to Chris.
Thank you, Larry. I think it's a testament to your you as a mentor that you talking about me as a teaching assistant sort of still brings a smile to me, and I really appreciated that opportunity, and thank you for everything, including meeting my parents. My father burst out of a car to greet you on graduation. You were very, very kind. So a few things. First is, as Steve said, it definitely is, when we compare and we look at democracy globally, we often compare it, if you will, the high water mark of democracy after the Cold War. And in the region that Steve and I both study, Latin America, that includes, internationally speaking, the 1992 Santiago Declaration, which committed countries in the hemisphere to defend democracy. It obviously included a series of blocks within the UN in an effort to create a bloc by Madeleine Albright to defend democracy, the Club of Democracies. There are a number of issues, and there was a sense that the liberal order was simply bound to happen, and that countries would abide by it, and regimes and autocrats would cower before the international consensus. That has frayed. That is frayed, obviously, within the hemisphere, and it's not frayed simply by the usual suspects, say, in Latin America, former president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, now Nicolas Maduro, but it's also happened from the former president of the Dominican Republic pulling out of the Inter-American System of Human Rights on issues of treatment of Haitians, or Dominicans of Haitian descent, rather. But also the Trump administration has shown that it will tolerate no questioning of its internal practices concerning immigration and treatment of immigrants. So we're looking at a withering, if you will, of a liberal international order that was seen as being very positive, but may in fact have been only a temporary phenomenon. It may not have been sustainable given what we know about how countries pursue national interests, but also what we're seeing about the resurgence of populist nationalism. Within this idea that sort of this reassertion of the notion of national sovereignty against the rights of international regimes to weigh in on what would be seen, or was seen certainly pre-1945, as being domestic considerations. That is certainly with it. And what we see too, troublingly internationally, is the struggles of certain institutions, liberal institutions, international multilateral institutions, to be able to push back. And I live now in London. We see struggles of the EU to be able to investigate, even raise concerns in Poland or Hungary. When I remember I went to probably was even my first American Political Science Association confab in the early 1990s. And, the flavor of that conference was how great the European Union integration was going to be for human rights and the consolidation of liberal norms domestically, not just internationally. Now, it clearly failed in terms of transmitting democratic norms internationally, in terms of people's sense of their accountability of those institutions. But it's certainly struggling in the case of Poland and Hungary, where these autocratic leaders still maintain a very strong base that is pushing back, and they can use that in many ways to rally. So the international order is very much a threat. What does that mean in terms of governments locally? Again, maybe we're seeing somewhat of a return to normalcy. We became too intoxicated by the halcyon days of the post-Cold War. I hope not. I mean, but the question ultimately is, and I'll talk about the United States very briefly in a second, since I no longer live there, have the benefit of no longer living there. My expertise is quickly evaporating. The problem here is how, because the decay of democracy stems in large part from the declining trust of institutions. So while people may not be supporting another form of government other than democracy in the abstract, their trust in those institutions that guarantee democracy, the checks and balances, elections, even sort of the sense of civic community has eroded. And I don't know, honestly, how you turn that corner, how you rebuild trust in institutions that has been battered by legitimate issues of corruption, by issues of cronyism, by issues of exclusion. In Latin America, the political parties that Steve has written about so eloquently that have collapsed in Peru and Ecuador and Bolivia, they were exclusionary, largely elite patronage clubs that were not, in fact, democratic political parties. How you rebuild those, I think, is really unprecedented. And it's a question that I think we'll have to see. And I think in many cases, certainly in the developing world, democracy will hinge on that. In the United States, I think the same is true. We've seen effectively the collapse of the Republican Party, as the Republican Party that my father knew and grew up with. How you rebuild a moderate, representative policy, program-oriented Republican Party in the United States is really going to be one of the main questions that our democracy is going to confront, and how you reinvigorate people's commitment to democracy, community in the United States, as we're seeing it being torn in a lot of ways, is very much the issue. And I think that's the challenge. And I don't think we have a roadmap for that. Thank you.
Well, Chris, you're absolutely right. We don't have a roadmap. And incidentally, some significant leaders of the Republican Party privately, because publicly they will never challenge Donald Trump. Never. And Steve mentioned as well that he expected, as most of us did, that the leadership of the Republican Party would rein Trump in to a certain degree. It just hasn't happened. Most of them have turned into enablers, and the others have practiced saying nothing, and they've done a very good job of it. So where do we go from here? How is a Republican Party that is an opposition party, assuming Biden wins and the Democrats carry Congress, how do they manage to reconstitute themselves to become competitive? That's very important. You can't have a real democracy without vigorous competition. So you made some very good points. Nicole, let's turn to you on that question.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you for this forum. I think the picture is very mixed. Obviously, democracy remains the leading and most common form of government around the world. But there's no question that places where we expected that democracy would never erode or would not have problems are seeing exactly that, which is both the United States, places in Western Europe, throughout Latin America, and a number of places in Asia and Africa as well. We do see a lot of reason to be hopeful that democracy still matters, right? People in Hong Kong still go to the streets because they understand what's at stake if you have a choice between two different systems. And I think that's just a reflection of the human spirit that wants to live in a place where you can worship, where you can where you can exercise your rights freely. But there's two dynamics which people have experienced, which have caused doubt and mistrust, as Chris is saying, in a democratic system. First is places where democracy has brought undemocratic leaders to the fore. And people have looked around the world and said, democracy brought us Orban in Hungary. Democracy has brought us Donald Trump and some of the undemocratic practices that he has shown and illiberal thoughts that he has shown. And a number of places, and people are starting to say, well, if this is undemocratic leaders, then what is this system about? It's also brought the question for where people have expected that democracy will deliver on everything that they want. It will deliver economically, it will deliver all of the rights, it will deliver on everything they want. And where it's not, and I would say where it's not, it's pretty much every country, because democracies don't work perfectly. Where it's not, people will tend to blame democracy for not doing everything that it wants. And when democracies do not protect all rights of minorities or women or other groups, or it does not deliver economically, people then say, well, maybe democracy isn't the thing that we thought it would be. The challenge is, I think in the halls of universities, we talk about democracy versus authoritarianism, but I think in the average person, when they experience democracy and they go to the streets to protest, they're not thinking necessarily of the alternative. They're thinking that this thing in front of them, this democracy, is not delivering. And so you're seeing democracies challenged in countries where people are going to the streets to say, it's not delivering in the way that I would like it to deliver. Last point I would say is I am concerned, while we haven't seen a takeover of another system, we certainly are seeing China's increasing influence in a lot of countries where it's not a wholesale takeover, but it's certainly China exercising its economic influence that comes with a political structure, that comes with a political practice that is problematic. And we're seeing that not only in China's engagement in individual countries, but we're also seeing it on the global scale, where we don't have as much leadership from democratic countries right now. We're seeing China asserting leadership in international organizations in a way which is most likely going to result in an erosion of democratic values on the international stage as well.
That's fascinating. And what's interesting about what you just said is how interconnected all of this is. Too many of us who focus on one country's politics, particularly America, miss so much of this. And the background is actually more important than the foreground. So I thank you for that. And following up on what you just said, Steve, in your book, How Democracies Die, you outline the four markers of an authoritarian leader, which we use in the documentary. While researching for the film, we tried to find video evidence from leaders around the world for each of those four markers. And probably because of the lack of film evidence that we could come across, we had difficulty finding them for many of the authoritarian leaders. But we found it very easy to find them for President Trump. I wonder why that is. Steve?
Well, it depends on the leaders. I mean, if there are the kind of behavior that Trump engages in, for example, encouraging, condoning, sometimes promoting violence, which is unusual in democracies. You can find that in autocratic leaders across the world. You can also find in autocratic leaders the vilification of opposition, calling the media an enemy and calling your political rivals a traitor. It's something that is shockingly unusual in established democracies. It's not surprising to me that you don't find it looking around at other elected governments in the world. You've got to look at pretty hardcore autocracies to find that kind of behavior. I think the one place where it's been pretty obvious is Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil has engaged in very nakedly authoritarian rhetoric as Trump has. But it's true, Trump is an unusually openly autocratic figure. Now, it's a little bit, and the U.S. is a little bit of a distinctive case because in Trump's case, as dangerous as it is, it's kind of a performative authoritarianism. Trump, I don't know what he gets out of using this sort of rhetoric, but he doesn't have the authoritarian apparatus behind his threats that Vladimir Putin has, right? So it's hard for Trump to actually, at least so far, to actually sort of fulfill to back up his worst rhetoric. An exception to that, which worries me tremendously, we've seen in recent weeks, is his encouragement of violence. I mean, we are so armed and so polarized that I don't know if Trump fully understands the implications of embracing violent militia activities. But the United States suffered 3 political deaths 2 weeks ago. 3 political deaths. That not at the hands of the state, but they were political deaths. And that does not happen in most established democracies.
And you know, Steve, what's really going to be interesting is whether he goes further after November 3rd, assuming he loses. We don't know what's going to happen. Maybe he'll win, maybe he'll lose. Critically, the margin will matter. If it's a substantial margin, he may simply pull back. It may not be possible, but it's so easy to imagine how he will try and marshal his forces. And they number in the millions. The Trump advocates number in the millions. And they're well armed. Many of them are very well armed. This could be a real crisis for the United States that maybe has parallels in other countries. Do you have any examples? And Nicole and Chris, do you have any examples of where democracies have broken down because of an election result and the unwillingness of a leader to accept those results? Have there been any of the three of you? Have there been any examples that you can cite historically or in recent times?
Over an individual election. I mean, in most Democratic breakdown cases, it is it's not an election crisis out of the blue. There is a period of usually years of buildup, and that was the case in the United States with the Civil War too. I mean, the United States also suffered a regime breakdown in the 1860s. But in most cases where fully democratic regimes have broken down, and there aren't that many historically, it's been sort of years of polarization, growing violence, threats, conflicts that are resolved, and then eventually it breaks down. Historically, most breakdowns have been taking place via military coup, which is not going to happen in the U.S. Those were not around elections. So Spain wasn't directly around election. Chile wasn't directly around election. Brazil in the 60s wasn't directly around election. Germany wasn't directly around election. I'll have to think. I'll let my colleagues who are more knowledgeable than I, but I'll try to think of a case in which the breakdown is directly in response to an election.
I don't have a case that comes to mind as well, Steve, but I will say what we have seen more frequently is a systematic undermining of democratic institutions. So not just the day and not just an undermining of the peaceful transition of power, which is really a 24-hour period or a week's period that you're talking about. What we've more often seen is a consolidation of power that the executive branch does over time. And that's what's concerning, is whether you see that happening in the United States or not. And where you see any government in any country where the executive fails to recognize its limits, fails to respect what the checks and balances are that are in the system to control its power, and starts to erode those over time, that's where we see the biggest challenge now. And the problem with that is that it appears to the average citizen as just normal bureaucratic behavior over time. And so there's not an outrage as there would be if there was an election that was stolen. It's this slow degradation of institutions and processes that is most dangerous right now. And that's what we see. It's almost the utilization of democratic systems for undemocratic purposes. And that just is a sleight of hand which people don't necessarily respond to, but is just as dangerous as a day's overthrow.
That's interesting. And of course, there has been some of that under President Trump. He continually suggests that the executive branch is the branch of government and has dominion somehow over the legislative and judicial branches. That's disturbing. But let me ask, Chris, do you have something to add to this before I ask another question?
I've been racking my brain, which didn't take very long, for examples. The only one I can think of immediately is Algeria in 1992, when Islamists won the election and the military stepped in. Now that doesn't really, it was obviously the closest example, and it's not, I don't want to draw too close a parallel at all, is Argentina in 76, 77. When an election sort of ignited, it brought back Juan Perón, who had forged this very violent coalition of elements, sort of was unleashed upon his election that ultimately brought a military coup. Now, again, a coup isn't going to occur in the United States, but we're already seeing this incitement for violence in the United States in a context of declining trust around elections. It's also being stoked by this president and Fox News and the ways those elections, that it could, it may not bring, that election itself may not bring the curtain down on democracy, but it may be difficult later to be able to put those demons back in the box in a way that they've been stoked and fed. And we haven't even started to consider what a Trump in opposition will look like. He was already very toxic when it came to questioning President Obama's birth, and he got a lot of, now he could potentially be an ex-president with a Twitter account and be completely unbound in what he can say. And that could be the longer term damage than even what happens on November 3rd or November 4th.
Larry,
Yes, go ahead.
Can I just jump in on that? Because I think it's important for people listening to differentiate between sort of two baskets of debates that we have in a democracy. One, there's a whole set of public policy issues which are debatable. What is our immigration policy? What is our healthcare policy? What is our foreign policy? Those are areas where we should have rigorous civil debate because there's a variety of views in our country. And we should have differences of views across the aisle or different parties. The other is a basket of issues which are institutions and processes which are undebatable. And all Americans have to come together to protect those issues because we have a shared interest in them. So whereas we can debate immigration or we can debate healthcare, we cannot debate a free and fair election. We cannot debate the importance of an open professional media. We cannot debate the importance of a Congress that checks the executive branch's power. Those are things which all Americans, every party, every background, every demographic has to equally protect because that's the system that actually allows us to have those debates. And what we've seen now is a conflating of the two, because quite often what we are now seeing is an attack on the institutions or attack of the processes or the values. And when people push back, they say, well, that's just my view. That's just, I'm allowed to have that because we're in a place where we can debate these issues. And I think that this is where Americans have to push back and say, I'm happy to debate the public policy issues, and we need to do that, but I'm not going to debate across the aisle, because there should not be an aisle, on those things which are institutions and values which are absolutely essential that they are free and fair and objective in a democracy.
If only we haven't had 4 years of breaking norms and destroying fundamentals. That's right. The problem. And there's something else that I really want to ask the three of you. Part of the problem in the United States may be unique to us, or it may simply be that I don't know of comparable examples. But we have such a complicated election system with a polarized electorate, relatively even in some terms, so that it's easy to imagine again, if not this election, then coming elections, a deadlock between the Electoral College decision and the popular vote. And the vast majority of the systems I know of, the popular vote determines the presidency of that country or the leadership of that country. We don't have that. We have an ancient system that fit 1790 really well. And that's gone. That whole society is gone. And so there's an opportunity for an authoritarian leader to use a split like that, combining it with the complications of voting in a pandemic. You can think of other examples, to produce a deadlock that extends into the next term and gives him an opportunity to consolidate rule. Can you all think of other countries that have systems complicated enough to manipulate if you have an authoritarian leader? Anyone?
Yes, on our case studies here, Larry. I think your point is right on about the complexity of the American system, and I do think that I personally think it's time that we look at other ways of administering our election. I think where we see effective administration is also, though, places where we see more than two political parties, because what we've seen in the United States is because we have two parties, it's caused a push to the extremes in both parties' views, and there's not a rush to the middle. I think the United States would be well served if we were to have more political parties that would be representative of the nuance that people have in between different political views.
That makes a lot of sense. Chris and Steve, do you have something to add there?
Chris, you want to go or shall I?
You go first and I'll
Okay. So there are a number of countries that are regimes that are less than fully democratic, where an authoritarian elite has set up a complex system of, you can call them checks and balances. They're actually unelected bodies that limit the power of elected governments in ways that really distort democracy. So Thailand, Malaysia, Chile in the 1990s, Turkey for quite a while, especially in the 80s and 90s. So there are hybrid systems or many cases where authoritarian elements have designed institutions to limit democracy. That's not exactly how the case in the United States. I wanted to take off in a slightly different direction with the US. The Electoral College and to some extent the Senate are obviously old institutions designed for the Electoral College, totally different purpose. But they were not problematic. They were somewhat undemocratic in that they favored sparsely populated territories, right? Both the Senate and the Electoral College are biased towards sparsely populated territories. That was always bad for New York and it was always good for Wyoming, but it didn't have a partisan impact until recently. The trouble with these institutions today is that just for the last 20 years, as you know much better than I, Larry, the Republicans have become electorally a party of sparsely populated territories, and the Democrats have become the party of the urban centers. So for the first time in history, always in the past, both parties had urban and rural wings. So it didn't have a major partisan effect. Only now do we see a systematic bias of the Electoral College and the Senate. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court nominees, even the Supreme Court, these critical institutions are biased toward the Republican Party. It's not the Republicans' fault. It just so happens that they're based in sparsely populated territories. But we're now in a position where, as Nate Silver showed the other day, if Biden wins by 3 points in the presidential race, in the popular vote, he's likely to lose the election. In order to win an election, the Democrats have to win a large majority of the vote. That is bordering on out minority rule.
Yes, and it's a formula for disaster and violence. Especially if it continues. If you have this pattern every quadrennium, then inevitably people are going to rebel. It's no longer really a small d democratic system, which is fundamentally what we're talking about.
But as long as the Republicans remain a sort of a bastion of small town white Christians, that will be the case.
Chris, did you have something to add here?
Just, I agree with Steve in that, the cases there are plenty of cases of autocrats designing institutions to sort of mask their consolidation of power and to create disproportional representation that favors them. This is a case of a system that, as you said, Larry, it worked in 1790 and we still have it. And there are examples of basically politics and socioeconomic and demographic shifts that have outstripped the original institutions. We're seeing one actually right now in the case of Lebanon, a system that Aaron Leipart spoke very highly of in terms of consociationalism that now is become basically is the target of legitimate citizen frustration and anger against the system. So, and the problem is in these cases is if they become path dependent, is how do you actually reform these institutions because you already have vested interests in the way politics is carried out. And again, about the issue of not having a roadmap, here's a situation where how can you seriously reform institutions, in the case of the Electoral College or others, when distrust is such high levels. Again, don't know a historical precedent for when a much needed reform has been able to take place in such a polarized environment when trust in institutions has been so low. And I think that, again, it speaks to the need to rebuild that level of trust to, if you will, initiate those sets of reforms, which are long overdue. And will, I think, I agree with you, Larry, will ultimately could lead to the sorts of violence that we all fear.
Well, you've used the right word, I think, healing. If we're going to de-escalate, we need a healer or healers in high office and a spirit of healing in and out of government. And we have none of that right now, which is really worrisome, very, very worrisome. The other complication, of course, is that the values and attitudes of those in rural America are increasingly divergent from those in urban and suburban America. It's hard to bring people together under these circumstances. And then partisan polarization, which is worse than it's been since the Civil War, on top of everything else. So it's a complicated government, 3 branches, and then the layers of federalism, and now some very peculiar circumstances with Donald Trump. It's quite a mix, and you're going to be happier still in the future, Chris, that you're in London. And look, while I've got you there, I want to ask you about an article that you recently wrote that was entitled Democracy Delayed, excuse me. Can you tell us how COVID-19 is affecting democratic governance, especially in South American countries, and how people there are responding? What's happening there because of this pandemic?
Well, as Steve knows very well too, and is you have, this is again occurring in a moment of political and institutional, I wouldn't say crisis, but is occurring in a moment of strain within the region. And in 2019, perhaps unfairly became known within the region as the year of social protests, with social protests in Bolivia and Chile, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, for different reasons. Unfortunately, I think many analysts, Steve not one of them, but many of them sort of lumped those protests together as being and blamed inequality, but they all had different roots. But the fact is these were very volatile political environments, and the protests were demanding particular institutional reforms that have not happened. In Chile, there was to be a constituent assembly election, or actually a referendum on whether to have a constituent assembly election. That's been postponed indefinitely. Bolivia.
No, it's scheduled. It's scheduled now.
Is it scheduled? Okay. I'll have to follow Trump's advice and vote there twice. But you had also an interim government after electoral dispute in Bolivia that's now, I think, scheduled for October, I believe. All of these things, you suddenly had a pressure cooker that you turn the heat up because of COVID and these delays in elections. You did have elections in the Dominican Republic after several delays. So there's that particular process. But at the same time, you have the classic populists of both the left and the right, of Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico and Bolsonaro, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who have, I think, tapped into a legitimate, particularly in Bolsonaro's case, tapped into a legitimate fear of people who work in the informal sector, in the shadow economies, who fear losing their livelihoods and seeing a reduction in their incomes, who cannot abide the quarantine measures. People, I mean, despite Brazil now is number 3 in the world in terms of COVID infections, but despite COVID infection rates, Bolsonaro remains very, very popular. The same thing with, very, very, about 30%, but more popular than people expected. AMLO remains actually quite popular, which speaks to, again, the base of these populations and their ability to speak sometimes in ways that don't quite match logic, but in ways to continue to stoke division, even in the time of COVID, in ways that may not be the most healthy for their citizens and the ways of resolving political discourse. Steve, you winced a bit when I talked about the approval rates. Do you have more recent approval rates for Bolsonaro?
No, I agree with your correction. Bolsonaro is doing better than we would have thought, but he's in the high 30s, low 40s. Yeah. He's about at Trump level of popularity. That's not overwhelmingly popular.
And of course, go ahead, Steve.
No, I think I agree with everything Chris said. Looking forward, Latin America I'm not an economist, but Latin America is probably headed for a very difficult economic period over the years to come. The rich countries may be able to spend their way out of this crisis and recover relatively quickly in the next few years. That's going to be much harder in Latin America. And most Latin American governments, maybe all Latin American governments, are going to face severe fiscal crises. And in societies as unequal as Latin America, the periods of long fiscal austerity where you cannot seriously address issues of poverty and inequality are trouble. And so my fear is that we could be headed towards something, in the worst case, akin to Europe in the 1930s, where prolonged economic malaise leads to real pressure on democracies and collapse of democracies. That's a worst case scenario.
You all have put me in a state where I need a few antidepressants. So we're going to have to break shortly. But you're being honest, and this is the way it is. And it's fascinating that in so many countries, Brazil and the United States and others, it's enough to have the support of somewhere around 40%. You're right. Trump, no matter what Trump does, no matter how many controversies, no matter how many outrageous things, he's always at 40, 41, 42. And then there's a little hidden Trump vote too. So he's not far away from where he was 4 years ago. It's not far to 46. The major change being you don't have significant third parties challenging, and therefore you probably have to win upper 40s to actually win the election, though the Electoral College complicates that. We need to, as we're wrapping up here, and I want to start with Nicole, so much of this depends obviously on what happens in democratic elections, but what can you offer from your research, from your travels, from your knowledge, that would give people hope that we're in a tough patch now, but democracy can recover, not just in a specific country, but globally through this interconnectedness where one society becoming more democratic may encourage greater democracy elsewhere? What can you cite specifically or generally to encourage our audience and give us hope?
Excellent. Happy to jump in on that. I think. Sorry. Nicole? Yes, thank you. I think there's two things that give me a tremendous amount of hope. One is history and one is human spirit. One, if you look historically over the course of the United States' history and over the course of global history, certainly since the Second World War, but well before the Second World War, we have been on a trajectory, a positive trajectory, where there has been an increasing amount of democratic freedoms and of democratic governments in the world. And that trend, although it is challenged now unquestionably, and we're having some setbacks in a number of places, that is the trend that has gone on in the world. And if we look at what's happened in the United States, where were we 300 years ago? Where were we 200 years ago? Where were we in the 60s? Where are we now? We have a lot of problems in the United States, but we are on the right trajectory. And what that tells me is that is the arc of history, right? And it bends towards justice. And that is as true today as it always has been. And that is because of the second issue, which is the human spirit. Democracy is a reflection of people's human spirit, that they want to live freely, and that there just simply is not another governing system in which people's rights and people's freedom and people's ability to flourish in a society are protected and advocated. It's not a perfect system. It's not a flawless system. It's not a guarantee of anything, but it is the best that we have. And it is what people constantly come back to. And it's what we have seen in history as courageous people have chipped away at injustices and undemocratic practices. They've chipped away just to make democracy stronger around the world. And so those two things give me hope, because neither of those things have gone away, even in this time of difficulty.
That is wonderful. It's poetic. It is inspiring. And you lifted my spirits, and I thank you for that. All right. Let's go now to Steve, and then finally to Chris. We'll have to wrap it up and do a terrific job of that. So let's go first to Steve.
Okay, well, I'm glad Chris is doing cleanup, because I'm not going to be as hopeful as Nicole. In fact, Nicole flipped. I started off optimistic, and I'm going to end more pessimistic than Nicole. I'm less confident in an arc of history or in any trajectory. I think it is an open question. The existence, survival, and success of democracy in the next 20, 30, 50 years is an open question. We have to fight for it, and we have to learn how to make democracies work and work better if it's going to continue to thrive and prevail. Thus far, I agree with Nicole, thus far, democracy continues to prove to be the least bad form of government in the eyes of most citizens, at least in the countries of the world that I study. And that's not a small thing. The fact that there's not a serious rival to democracy to date is very, very important. But we have no idea what will emerge to contend with liberal democracy in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Let me make one stab at optimism. And that is, I think that the United States has a good chance of muddling through this crisis. The United States is going through a crisis that I don't think another democracy has ever really gone through. And that is that a founding and long dominant ethnic majority is losing its dominant status. We're going through a transition in which a dominant ethnic group is losing its dominant status, losing its electoral majority, and losing its dominant status in society. And that is a profoundly threatening thing. That, to me, if I had to point to one thing, is the primary cause of the earthquake that our polity is suffering right now. Now, the United States, compared to most democracies in the world, has a lot of experience dealing with diversity, dealing with immigration, dealing with demographic change. And I think there's a pretty darn good chance that we make it through this transition. In fact, there is evidence that we're getting there. If you look particularly at younger Americans, racial tolerance has gone way up, openness has gone way up, and we are seeing the emergence, particularly in the protests this summer, of a broad multiracial coalition that I think can be the foundation of a successful U.S. democracy in the 21st century. And if we do that, if we manage to get through this transition, and we manage to consolidate a truly multiracial democracy, which I think we can, I think the United States can then become a model that can be used. I mean, the U.S., again, is not a model anymore. We once were, we have been in the past. We are not today. But if we manage to get through this and establish a truly successful multiracial democracy, that we can be a beacon, a liberal beacon against ethno-nationalism elsewhere in the world. And so that's, for me, the positive scenario.
That was far more optimistic than I expected from you, Steve. That's terrific. All right, Chris, who's living in Britain, they're experts at muddling through. What do you have to offer us?
We're certainly doing that with Brexit right now. And actually, as a point of, from Europe, it does give a certain perspective, and it's not entirely an optimistic one. I think many people thought, and I'm not even talking about domestic politics and the rise of ethno-nationalism and Brexit, but I think many people thought that Europe would rise up and sort of assert its own worldview and strengthen and bolster international institutions in ways that it hasn't done. Donald Trump will be loath to admit this, but basically we see this sort of residual free ridership of Europe, not on matters just of the U.S. budget, but in terms of U.S. leadership. Sitting here, I think I expected much more sort of pushback when it came to whether NATO or democratic institutions, and they've been silent, and that's deeply, deeply troubling. That's not a positive note, though, and I'm going to try to end, Larry, on a positive note. And I'd say there are several things. The first is trying to imagine a positive scenario in COVID on this, and we're seeing increased recognition of inequality and its cost in politics and the effects of quarantine and COVID on issues of the informal sector, on issues of race-based, differential effects of COVID, gender-based, in ways that it really has elevated. And Britain next year will be hosting the G20, and on the agenda is trying to reform the international financial institutions to address issues of social policy and social insurance. In the United States, we're seeing there's just a great series of articles, actually, the New York Times pulled together on renewed support for labor unions. And I think that's deeply positive, even from some Republicans who have basically kowtowed to Trump are now talking about the need for social insurance and labor unions. I know Virginia is a right to teach state, I guess, because we couldn't unionize as grad students. Hopefully that will change. And I think we're seeing a certain amount of momentum towards more social issues. And I'll just end on this issue. When I was in graduate school with you, Larry, I won't say how long ago, it was longer than you said. While we didn't have as much reason to fear for democracy in the United States, we also didn't have people engaged in the way Steve said. And when I was teaching at Columbia, I used to ask my students in a class on political development, how many planned on going into politics? And initially, when I started teaching there, 5 in a class of 50 would raise their hands. 20, 25, half the students, not just US students. Well, and it was interesting, Hispanics, Muslim Americans, but also students from other countries raised their hands and said they were going to commit to politics. And I know politics is a good thing, Larry, and you've been promoting that. You're ahead of your time, because indeed, now I think students in the United States and my international students at Columbia have begun to realize that. And I think that's a deeply positive thing. It may take a generation, or not a couple decades to get there, but I think we're beginning to see people wake up and understand this. And that to me gives me hope. It may not happen November 3rd, but I think within a couple electoral cycles, not just in the United States, but globally, we'll begin to see differences.
Well, you've moved beyond my lifespan, Chris, so I have a hard time relating to that. But you're right; it was a positive note.
You'll be looking down on us from the.
I hope I'm not looking up, but I know for sure I'm going to be 6 feet under. Yeah. But that's another subject entirely. Look, you three were terrific, and I want you to know that you really helped to make this 3-part series, Dismantling Democracy. We are so lucky that we got the 3 of you to participate, that you were willing to give us so much time and make the effort you have, and also that you study what you study, because it is critically important. And we've come to realize that around the world, but also in the United States, where I think we were arrogant and took too much for granted. We don't anymore. And maybe that's also the beginning of change. So thanks to you 3, thanks to Virginia Public Media. Don't forget, the next episode 2, will air at 8 p.m. on September 15th. Your PBS schedules. You can also find it on podcasts. You can find all the information you need on our website, centerforpolitics.org. Thank you all very much, and I hope this is a series that you will also show in class and spread the word about it. We need to get this message out. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, Larry.
Larry, thanks for hosting.
Thank you.
Thank you.